How do you go about defending a belief that's so fundamental it holds up everything else you think? It's a huge challenge, right? Well, today, we're going to dive into one of the most radical answers to that very question, from a 20th century thinker you might not have heard of, Cornelius Van Til. I mean, seriously, where do you start? This is a question thinkers have wrestled with for centuries. Do you point to science, to logic, to your own personal experience? It turns out, your starting point is literally everything. And this is exactly where Van Til just completely flipped the script.
So just look at these two paths. The traditional way, the one we're all kind of used to, tries to build this bridge from what we call neutral ground, facts, evidence, logic, and hopes to arrive at the conclusion God exists. But Van Til comes along and says, nope, that's impossible. He argues you have to start with God, not as a conclusion you're trying to prove, but as the very foundation that makes logic and facts make any sense in the first place.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, here's our game plan. We'll look at his ultimate starting point, then see how that creates two totally separate worlds of thought. We'll tackle the paradox of common ground, look at his unique way of arguing, and then finish with the big one, the Van Til challenge. Let's get into it. All right, first up, an ultimate starting point. Van Til's core idea is actually pretty simple, but it's incredibly profound. You can't build a Christian house on a non-Christian foundation. Your starting point, your foundation, determines absolutely everything that follows. You see, what Van Til was getting at here is that you can't use some kind of supposedly neutral reason to prove the Bible is true. Why? Because the Bible itself claims to be the ultimate authority on everything. That includes God, humanity, and even reason itself. So for him, the Bible isn't the destination of your argument, it's the non-negotiable map you have to start with from the very beginning.
And this brings us to the key word for this whole thing, a presupposition. Think of it like this. It's a foundational belief you don't argue to, you argue from. It's the pair of glasses you wear that colors how you see everything else. Van Til's radical claim is that the only starting point that makes knowledge even possible is the God of the Bible, a God who doesn't need to be proven by anything else because he's the source of all proof.
Okay, so if that's the case, what happens when you have such wildly different starting points? Well, what you get are two entirely different worlds of thought, separated by this massive, unbridgeable gap. Van Til had a name for this, the antithesis. It's this idea that there's a complete, principled opposition between a worldview that starts with God and one that starts with human reason as the final judge. In his system, there's no neutral meeting spot, no middle ground. And this quote really lays out the stakes, doesn't it? He's framing this as a battle of ultimates. Is God the self-sufficient source of all meaning, truth, and reality, or is the individual human mind the final measure of all things? According to Van Til, you absolutely have to choose one. There is no third option. Van Til used this really powerful metaphor to explain this. He said the non-Christian isn't just someone who's missing a piece of information. They're viewing every single fact through a set of colored glasses, the presupposition of their own autonomy, that are, and this is his phrase, cemented to his face. So the issue isn't the fact they're seeing, it's the interpretive lens that they literally cannot take off. Okay, this all leads to a huge, glaring question. If there's this absolute divide, this antithesis, with no neutral territory, then how on earth can two opposing worldviews ever communicate? How is anything shared even possible? I mean, think about it. If the non-Christian starting point is fundamentally flawed, as Van Til claims, how can they discover real scientific truths? How can they create profound, moving art? How can they build just societies or even just live moral lives? How can they know anything true if their whole system is built on the wrong foundation? Van Til absolutely needed an answer for this. And his answer is a theological concept called common grace. The basic idea is that God gives a type of grace to all of humanity, not just to believers. And this grace kind of holds back the worst effects of a flawed worldview, which allows people to still use their God-given minds to discover truth and do good things, even while their foundational principles reject him. This analogy he uses of the prodigal son just captures it perfectly. The unbeliever can do science or reason morally, not because their own worldview makes sense of it, but because they're operating on what Van Til called borrowed capital. They're still using the substance of the Father, living in an orderly world, using a rational mind, even while they're in a state of rebellion. All right, so that's the theory behind it all. But how does this actually play out in a real conversation or debate? Let's take a look at the method in action. So Van Til contrasts two very different approaches.
The common method, the one he calls compromising, tries to meet the unbeliever on their supposed neutral ground. He saw this as basically agreeing to walk with someone down the wrong road, just kind of hoping they'll suddenly decide to turn around. But Van Til's method, the consistent one, refuses to take even a single step on that road. Instead, it challenges the road itself, arguing that only the Christian map makes any sense of roads or signs or destinations in the first place.
So, if neutral facts and logic aren't the point of contact, what is? Well, for Van Til, the true point of contact is found inside every single person. He argued that because every person is made in God's image, they have this deep, innate knowledge of God that they are actively pushing down or suppressing. So the goal of an argument isn't really to present new facts, but to expose the contradiction between what a person knows deep down and the worldview they've chosen to live by.
And all of this, it all builds to the final, most audacious part of his entire argument. This is the ultimate challenge he poses to every other way of thinking out there.
And here it is, plain and simple. Van Til's ultimate claim isn't just that Christianity is true, it's that the Christian God is the necessary foundation for intelligibility itself. In other words, without him as your starting point, you can't ultimately make sense of anything.
I mean, just think about how far this claim goes. Why can scientists count on the laws of logic? Why do we expect the universe to be orderly and predictable? Van Til argues that these basic acts of science, weighing something, measuring it, assuming that nature is uniform, they only make sense if you first presuppose a rational God who created a rational and orderly universe. A non-believer can absolutely do science, but Van Til would say only the Christian worldview can actually explain why science is even possible to begin with.
So in the end, Van Til's system really forces a choice. He argues there's just no such thing as a neutral standpoint. Everyone, the scientist, the philosopher, the skeptic, the believer, everybody begins with an unprovable foundational commitment, a presupposition. You could call it a leap of faith. The question he leaves us with isn't if you have faith, but which faith makes everything else make sense. And that is the defender's dilemma, and this was Van Til's revolutionary answer.